thought that was,
No.
and there it is.
Very nice.
That's it.
Very nice.
Seven.
Due diligence.
Let's see, roll call, Mayor Jacobs,
I am here.
Committeeman Hickey,
Here.
Mr. Strackhoff,
Here.
Mr. Travellini,
Here.
Mr. Rodelius.
Here.
You are the iPad, great, thank you. Mr. Leonard,
Here.
Mr. DiGiovanni is absent, Mr. Zepnik,
For the last time as a board member, present.
Oh,
Ms. Armana,
sweet.
Mr. Walter,
Here.
Chairwoman Gutschall.
Here.
Adequate notice of this meeting of the Bedminster Township Land Use Board was filed with the Township Clerk, sent to the Bernardsville News and to the Courier News and to all subscribers, and posted at the Township Municipal Building, 1 Miller Lane, Bedminster, New Jersey, on January 12th, 2021.
Okay, let's do the flag salute. Let's do really good tonight.
Okay.
All right.
First Scott.
First Scott.
Pledge allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the
Flag,
United States of
United
America,
States of America,
and to the republic
to the republic for which it stands,
and one nation
one nation,
under God.
liberty and justice for all.
Raw.
Wow, that was absolutely the worst.
The worst one.
That was.
You're getting worse, guys.
And you can't even blame me. I was muted.
Not your-
No,
That was
that
bad.
was not good. Needs
And
practice.
they even have a flag here by this pool. So.
We were doing so much better.
Okay, is there anyone on from the public, Janine?
Jake Perry.
Just Jake, okay.
Oh.
So,
Sorry, Frank's logging on again, or maybe it's an additional.
Yeah, that's my other screen. Thank you, Janine.
Sure.
okay, so we have no one from the public tonight. We do have minutes from May 6th. And if you've had a chance to look at those, we need a motion to approve.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
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 Anyone abstain?
I abstain. I wasn't there.
You were not there, Nick.
Aye.
Okay, minutes are approved. We have some correspondence from Michael Osterman that he's withdrawing the application for BD Associates. So that will be the end of that application. Determination of completeness. I guess that's your job there, Janine. Are you going to fill in for
I'll
Paul?
fill in for Paul.
Okay.
He sent them a letter dated May 26th that they were deemed incomplete.
This was
Who's that?
Westfield Hall,
Westfield Hall, which is the old Burger King.
Oh, okay, right.
right?
So they've been deemed incomplete. Old Farm Orchards is the next one. We just received them on May 13th. So hopefully we will have a response back from Paul, hopefully so that we can hear them in July. But they were the last to be given to us, so they're probably the closest to being heard.
Okay. There's no ordinances right now, nothing on the master plan. Old business. I guess that's what we need to talk about tonight. It's the cannabis approval for, I guess, Mayor, are you going to speak about that?
Right, so, as everyone on the planning board, or I'm sorry, the land use board has heard before, with the state's adoption of the cannabis laws, it puts the issue of permitting cannabis businesses to the municipalities. And there are 6 categories of cannabis businesses. And the municipalities have the option of opting out of allowing the cannabis businesses. But if municipalities are going to opt out, they must do so by August 21st. Do not opt out. If a municipality does not opt out, then it is presumed to have allowed cannabis businesses and cannot undo that situation. I think it's for 3 years.
5.
5 years. Okay. I've been talking about this for too long, for 5 years. However, if municipalities opt out between now and August 21st, they do have the option of opting back in and allowing cannabis businesses down the road. So where we currently stand with the cannabis or the implementation of the cannabis laws is that there's a commission, cannabis commission, that is going to work out of the state office and will eventually put together some rules and regulations regarding the cannabis businesses. But currently, those rules and regulations are nowhere. They don't exist at all. And for looking at, well, what is going to be a cannabis business, right? So there's the 6 categories, and Colin, anyone else, when I stumble, please fill me in. So you've got the grow facilities. Then you've got the processing or manufacturing facilities. Then you've got the distribution facilities. All right, I'm going to get there.
You get
Warehousing and
Selling, So you got-
delivery and retail.
delivery and retail dispensaries. So municipalities have the options of allowing all or none, or picking and choosing. But until the state promulgates the rules and regulations regarding how these businesses are going to be operated, what they're going to look like, and perhaps from the zoning position, how are they going to be operated? Is there going to be a requirement? So for a grow facility, right? So here we are in Bedminster, we've got thousands of acres of agricultural land. How are those grow properties or grow facilities, what are they going to look like? Is there going to be a requirement of big old stockade fencing and barbed wire and lights and security? Is that the type of thing that are we prepared to get into a situation where we're allowing a use when we don't know what it's going to look like? And I will say, in discussions I've had with the governor's office, they flat out told me, yeah, most towns, not all towns, but a lot of towns, man, I actually said most, are opting out because until the rules and regulations are coming out. So my liaison to the governor's office essentially said it would not be a bad idea to opt out. And then when the rules get introduced, reconsider your position later on in the year, if it is this year, or next year, if it's next year. But what we've done from the township committee position is I've asked each township committee person to go back to their various committees and boards and talk about the cannabis legislation and get a feel from each of those boards and committees and report back to the township committee as a whole as to what everyone is thinking. And Colin, is also not only on the land use board, but he's also liaison to Board of Health. And Board of Health actually looked at this issue before the legislation was passed and made some recommendations. I guess it was last year.
Right.
With the new legislation in place, they actually prepared a memorandum, which will be presented to the township committee on at our next meeting on Monday. Gina Fernandez went to the recreation committee and asked them for their input, and she reported back last week. And I've raised the issue here a couple times, and since we have nothing else on the agenda, let's talk about cannabis and the impact on our zoning. And then I will report back, or Carol, if you want to do a quick write-up, and then we can have that presented at the township committee meeting on Monday. And eventually, township committee will make a decision to move forward with ordinances regarding cannabis businesses in town, whether allowing them or not allowing them, allowing some of them, but not others, or taking no action, in which case we will default into the opt-in category under the legislation. So this is really sort of an open discussion amongst the planning board members. I think multiple times I've talked about the presentation that the McElroy Deutsch law firm presented to the township committee is up on the town website. There's also some other information from a group, excuse me, called Community in Crisis. Gina also reported on that as well. So there's a fair amount of information that Bedminster has posted, and plus, everyone's been reading about it, see what some of the other towns are doing. I will tell you, Somerville and Raritan Borough have both decided to allow cannabis businesses, including retail dispensaries. Somerville already has a medical dispensary in town, so for them, they obviously feel comfortable with it. Bridgewater has said no, they've opted out. Bernards Township is either they've opted out or they're in the process of opting out. Burnsville is also, I believe, in the process of opting out.
Far Hills, Far Hills?
I don't know about Far Hills.
I assume it's not.
Chester has also opted out, so a neighbor to the north. So there it is. That's the topic for discussion. And
Mhm.
Carol, I'll leave it to you to run the discussion forward.
Well, I brought it up at my Four Oaks meeting last night, just to bring my board members up to speed, since it started at the township level, land use level, master board level. So I brought it to Four Oaks level last night, just so they were aware of it. And we've also opted to do nothing at this time.
Right.
We figure we'll let the town lead the way, and if and when we need something done, then we will do it.
Right. I will, you've actually raised something that I neglected to mention. So one of the other liaison positions is Renee and
Me.
Renee and
They call
Colin.
They keep it straight.
Renee and Colin are liaisons to the condo
Master.
associations,
Yeah.
to the masters.
Mhm.
So
Right.
Renee and Colin had a sit down with Hills Village North
Yep.
and talk through, and one of the other things I do want to mention is that the legislation just wasn't something that the governor and the legislature, spontaneously moved forward with cannabis legislation. This was a referendum put to New Jersey voters.
To the
and New
residents.
Jersey voted
Yeah.
overwhelmingly
Yeah.
to support, or not to support, but voted in
Allow,
favor
yeah.
of legalizing recreational marijuana. So,
All right.
what you folks may have positions, whether it should be done or shouldn't be done, but the fact is that the state has allowed it. And since the state has allowed it, it's law. And so it's now up to us. So there's things that we can do and can't do. So the use of cannabis is legal in New Jersey. Wait for Rich to.
It
turn
is
his phone
you,
off.
Rich.
Rich, you gotta turn the phone off, brother.
There you go.
So
All right.
So things we can't say you can't use it in town.
Right.
Maybe they'll say you can't use it in the township properties. The law does not allow you to use cannabis in an aerosol manner in public spaces, right? So you can't smoke in a public space, so that doesn't always mean public parks, but can mean any public space, including retail establishments. But if someone is going to consume it in the privacy of their own home or other situations, that's legal.
Comes down to
Can I grow
enforcement.
my own?
Comes down to enforcement.
Yes.
You can in limited quantities.
Not
You
yet,
can
not yet.
enforce it if it's legal. I
Not-
mean, there's
not yet.
nothing to be done.
And so ingestion, right? So there's the air, I mentioned aerosolization, so smoking, vaping, but the edibles, right? That's another use that doesn't, could you have an edible while you're in the public space? And I believe the answer is yes.
Yeah.
If you live in the condominiums, and this is one of the reasons we push this back for presentation to the condos, is we can't enforce.
Correct.
Right, this is now legal, but for the condominiums, the issue's got to be up to you guys, just as, do you allow smoking on a common patio or in the common space? Okay,
Well, and that is the crux of the issue. I mean, for anybody who voted yes when the referendum came through, there was almost an assumption that the state would have some guidelines for municipalities, and it's clear that they don't, and they have dropped the ball on this, just like we all knew kind of that they would. It seems to me that our town, in the spirit of almost prudence, should almost opt out until there are some state guidelines with regard to taxation, regulation, just even tracking and FDA approvals for what is being sold, because quite frankly, this is a drug and this has to be regulated by the FDA. And if it's not the federal, it's got to be the New Jersey Department of Food and Drugs.
Approach it like Rutherford approaches being a dry town. But obviously,
You don't want to do the Bergen County thing where you just say,
I don't think so, right?
so you, to some extent, you can, the legislation allows towns to say, you can't have cannabis businesses. However, the legislation is also clear. You can't prevent the delivery into your town. So, everyone's been joking, well, it's Uber Weed instead of Uber Eats. But that's it exactly. That's exactly the business model. And yes, so if there's a delivery place that will go down to Somerville and bring it to Bedminster, we can't prohibit that.
do we think, Larry, do we think the state will eventually regulate that part of it? How it's moved around between townships and counties? Is the state actually going to come up with guidelines for that?
That might be something that the commission is supposed to do. We don't know.
So I almost think you have to defer until they figure it the F out.
Yeah, so I'm with Scott. I think until we have guidance on what the regulations are gonna be and how that's gonna impact the zoning and the land use impacts of cannabis businesses in town, we have to opt out because we have no idea what the ramifications are gonna be if we opt in and we're gonna be stuck with it for 5 years.
To Rich's point, he's saying a dry town, but that doesn't mean you can't drink in the town.
Right, of course.
Yeah,
So
you just
you can
can't.
have it delivered.
Yeah.
You
right.
can call up the Uber Weed or whatever it's going to be called.
order it on Amazon.
And,
Yeah.
and it'll be delivered and you can consume. But the town could say, we're not going to allow grow, we're not going to allow processing, we're not going to allow distribution, we're not going to allow wholesaling, warehousing,
Delivery,
Other
the
than blood
delivery
test,
and the dispensary.
retail.
Other than a blood test, there's no way for the cops to know whether you're under the influence, right?
But that's a
You'd have to give you,
Which
They
the
probably
blood
need-
tests,
what they
Doesn't
which
show.
they probably need
the blood tests don't work.
Doesn't show, right?
Because unlike a because the
Oh, it's residual. It stays in your system for 90 days.
you would have to know whether or not the marijuana drug that is showing up in the test is from that time. As opposed to, I ingested in my house 3 days ago, and the reason you're fine, the reason that blood is showing any marijuana is not from when I was in a speeding or in a traffic accident.
A real sobriety test is what's in order here, and I don't think it exists.
And
Do
one
a
at a
field
time,
sobriety test, but that's about it.
Well, we do real sobriety tests for people that are under the influence of opiates, right? You get pulled over, they give you a sobriety test, they make you touch your nose, they make you walk a line, you have to say the alphabet. It's the same idea. There are complications, but that's not a land use impact. That's a
Yeah, so
enforcement.
there's two different ordinances that the town is considering. One is about use in the parks and in the areas we do control. And then the other is zoning related.
Yeah.
So allowing businesses to be located in town. And that is really the issue before the land use board.
I support a lot of the comments that were made about being cautious and waiting for regulations and so forth. The only thing I can think of where I would want some retail outlets in town is I'd rather have kids and people buying, drugs that have been gone through some inspection, as opposed to buying something on the street corner from who knows who, and getting into trouble that way. So I think there is a little bit of argument for ultimately, not right now perhaps, to have some kind of retail availability.
And Nick,
At this point, I don't think there's anything in place regarding, inspections. I mean, they're going to sell it, but is the state going to inspect it before it's sold?
Well, I agree with you that all that has to be worked out before we allow any such transaction to take place. I'm just thinking in the future, assuming we do have a regulated product.
So long as it's inspected and taxed and regulated and
Right.
there's a chain of custody and provenance, because who knows? I mean,
Yeah.
awful things get sprayed on things. It's
well, and
I have a stepson who's
let's go to the states.
from California, and he's got a little box, like.
right. It's certified and the state inspects it.
I'm here.
So I do want to talk about what are the issues that was just raised about the chain of custody. And really, when you look at the businesses that the state is allowing, it really sets up sort of, what we use in the environmental industry, the cradle to grave, right? So from growing all the way to the retail dispensary, that it should be, each batch is regulated in each element of the transaction as it goes from the grow facility to the processing facility to warehouse, wholesale distribution, to retail dispensary, and then to the delivery companies that are going to be doing it.
Each one of these 6 phases, or whatever you call
businesses.
each one of them has to have a separate certification and, talk about chain of custody or whatever. So until that is in place, I'm with Nick. We can and defer for now. And if we decide later on there's something that's appealing, I don't even know if it makes sense considering, zoning restrictions. Ultimately, I could see some farmer having a small portion of his property set aside for growing this stuff. But until all this other stuff is in place, how do we?
Right, and it's what's interesting about the legislation, it actually, so there are the regular licenses, and then there's these micro licenses, which would allow, I'm probably gonna get it wrong, what was it, 2,500 square feet for
I was just
growing?
looking that up.
Yeah, I think that was the micro. So a micro business could get a license to grow on a small patch of land. And the towns can allow the micro businesses.
2,500 square feet. I could do it in the corner. I could do it like my tomato garden.
Yeah, yes, yes.
But then you gotta have security and barbed wire
Right, you-
and armed guards and all that fun stuff.
Goes with it, right? So now you go, okay. so
Do
what goes
we,
with
do
it?
we at this point or no?
We don't, we
There's no
don't, we
regulation.
don't. There's no guidance. The rules and regs are not yet issued.
So what is the place like? Approved?
Who's gonna keep the 15-year-olds out of Farmer Brown's pumpkin patch?
Farmer Brown.
Who's gonna
With a shotgun and some rock salt? I mean, really?
15-year-old from hanging around the dispensary, finding some old guy to buy him a case of beer as opposed to, a stash of hash.
It was Boone's Farm in the day.
I was one of those guys, Scott.
You were a Boone's Farm guy?
Brave soul. When I was 14, maybe.
So yes, these are, and by the way, this is why I and the Township Committee are bringing this to the land use board, right? To go through this discussion.
I understand that.
When is the committee going to make a decision? When do they want all the information back?
We want all the information back for discussion at the Township Committee level by Monday.
Okay, I think I'm in agreement with, Anna, Nick, Scott, that it's hard to discuss this when you don't have the facts.
Right.
So we can just guess at what's going to happen, but that doesn't make sense. So I'd be in agreement with them.
Is it in
Opting
order
out
for us to
now.
make a motion as a board to?
Yeah, I was just going to ask the other board members if they have anything further they want to add to it.
Just, Mr. Collins, what are your thoughts with regarding, all of this?
Tom, you're muted.
Tom is muted.
Sorry, muted. You've all made great comments and Larry's done a great summary and Colin too of what the committee is facing. And the first thing I would say is it's totally a policy decision. I would also urge you to realize that in the legal sense, it's totally a policy decision of the township committee, the governing body, to which you could give advice. One important thing that maybe didn't come up or was a little unclear was right now the statute does not allow home growing. So I don't know how they're going to prevent people from doing it and claim that it's illegal, but or enforce against it, but technically it's not yet lawful to grow your own. There are proposals to amend the statute to allow up to so many plants, 5 or 6 plants or something like that, which probably will pass because probably people do want that right and probably people will not want to pay the extraordinary taxes and charges that will be incurred for legal marijuana. But so the reality is, though, that as of the statute adoption, the smoking and ingestion of cannabis products is totally decriminalized. So that's not even debatable. That's not something a municipality in New Jersey can regulate.
Doesn't matter the source.
Doesn't matter the source. It's only basically use of marijuana is decriminalized. It may not be lawful to sell and possess it, and that's going to be hard to enforce if and when the lawful marijuana is easily obtained. But that being said, the point I want to make is that this is all new. It is, as Larry said, derived from a constitutional amendment. The constitutional amendment didn't go so far as to say you can grow it and sell it in every property in the state of New Jersey. So the argument that the constitutional amendment means you can't regulate it is not a very strong argument. Right now you have until August 21st, or all townships have until August 21st to either opt in, opt out, or opt in for some uses, But also, and we should stress this, you could regulate it to the extent you opt in. So in other words, if you allowed cultivation, you could allow it under certain standards that you set. There's some chance that you will be preempted by the state regulations. In fact, this field is likely to involve a lot of preemption, or let's call it taking over by the state. But technically, under the statute right now, if you opted in, you can opt in for any one of the 6 business licensed categories, all subject to the licensing. So they can't do it before they get licensed. Also, you could set in the ordinances those standards that you would want to do. That's pretty hard to do in this short amount of time. So prudence, as Anna said, is basically seems to make sense to opt out and then decide later whether and to what extent you would want to opt in after you know more about those potentially preemptive regulations. There other thing you should know is that I don't fully understand how they envision this, but the literature about this claims that municipalities are going to be able to decide who gets a license and who doesn't get a license and where they get a license, where they don't get a license. I find that to be a ridiculous position of the state and of the people that say that, because it's really hard to deny a license to one and grant a license to another once you allow the use. So that being said, I don't have a policy decision, recommendation for you, other than, you all have great knowledge and great ideas. You want to give your advice to the committee, I can help you craft a motion. You can get general or detailed as much as you want to. Our field for you is, let's call it the master plan and the land use ordinances. This requires a land use ordinance. This requires a zoning ordinance. That's not fully understand. I don't even think the legislature understood what they wrote when they wrote the statute about this subject. But basically what they said is if you don't opt out, they're lawfully permitted uses for cultivation and manufacturing in industrial zones, distribution and warehouse there as well. And as conditional uses without conditions for retail in all retail zones. So that's what the current statute authorizes. It allows, it makes them permitted or conditional, in all of the zones that the statute says. So if you don't think that's a good idea, you could recommend it to the council committee and introduce an ordinance that prohibited some or all of those types of uses. It basically gets added to the general standards of what are prohibited uses in Township of Bedminster. Then the Township Committee, if they were to introduce it, would refer it over to the Planning Board, the Land Use Board, for a consistency review. That takes it could take up to 35 days, and then they can act. If you acted sooner, they can act even sooner than 35 days, about 14 days later. But your schedule is such that you probably don't meet. Well, you do meet next Thursday, they meet next Monday. If they were to introduce next Monday, you could do a referral report next Thursday. If they waited to July, you would do your referral report in July, but it has to get to second reading, public hearing and adoption before August 21st, 2021, or it will not be effective and the authority of the town will be lost for 5 years. So that helps you see that the timing is very short. And I would say Frank could type in too, but we thought about it. We talked about it. The master plan does not talk about cannabis, so it clearly is at least not inconsistent, double negative with the master plan, because quite frankly, most municipal master plans do not talk about cannabis or marijuana or any drugs. And so it is likely that the board would find it to be at least not inconsistent with the master plan. And then the committee can go ahead and adopt it with a simple majority, and they don't have to do any statement of reasons why. So that's sort of the setting you're in, but I defer to you on the policy recommendation.
Thank you, Tom.
Tom, one question. If we opt out, do we at any point open ourselves up for any liability by restricting somebody from wanting to get into this business in the meantime?
I wouldn't say you get into liability. You know, you know the rule, Rich. Anybody can sue anybody anytime for anything. So idiots do sue, and they sue because if they have a lot of money. So the likelihood of that is very low. I think you can assume that most municipalities are going to opt out. And then it's going to be sort of I would call it a beauty contest, whether someone comes to a town and convinces them to change an ordinance to let their use be in some location in the town. But I would say that, as Larry said, some towns are opting in and are fully on board, and maybe that'll take the vent off other towns. I saw something doing research on this that was interesting, that the Township of Lafayette a few years ago adopted an ordinance to allow conditional use of cannabis, medical marijuana, medical cannabis growing, and effectively at a place that was a former Schering-Plough Merck animal research facility with over 100 acres and buildings that are worth millions and millions of dollars that were easily convertible to a grow facility with perfect security and fencing and, you know, hidden away from the rest of the world. And they actually came in for site plan and got approval. I don't know if it's been built or yet or anything, but there's an example where one type of use, cultivation, even before this statute, was deemed to be advisable and good to that municipality because of what they could put into the controls of that conditional use ordinance. And so each municipality may have its own preferences, and you may have your own preferences, and the good part about opting out is you theoretically still have in my opinion, you have the right to opt in at any time for any one or more of the license categories. I would also tell you, though, that there are attorneys who I don't agree with out there, particularly often advocates for cannabis, who think that you somehow cannot opt in after you opt out. I think that's contrary to their interests. I think they're kind of talking out of both sides of their mouth when they say that, but there are people putting that in writing in the newspapers. So, but that's pretty typical. So you make the call, the committee makes the call in Bedminster, and the committee does seek your advice. So this is very good and open, and is a great discussion for you all to have made tonight.
And Tom, since you made mention of it, just wanted to be clear, everything we're discussing here is on recreational marijuana. Nothing that we're contemplating gets between a doctor and their patient. So we just wanted, because there was confusion, we've had some conversations just to clear that up. This is recreational marijuana as opposed to medical marijuana.
That's correct. And the medical marijuana is totally lawful, is set up already. It already exists. It already has licensed facilities. It has significant restrictions on the method by which it is licensed and distributed, as we all sort of know and observe. And, you know, I would tell you that the potential interrelationship between medical marijuana developers and users or companies and recreational is probably an easier lift than new recreational manufacturers and just, you know, licensed facilities. And so I would expect that medical licensed facilities are going to try to become also recreational facilities, and that wouldn't be surprising at all. It would be logical. And that may result in pressures of towns that have a recreational facility, licensed facility, to seek to convert, to expand, to have an additional license for recreational. I don't think you have any, so I don't see that as a problem for you. So that's sort of a summary. I would tell you this, I do think that cultivation, from what I'm reading about and learning, it seems like cultivation is usually done in a controlled environment with either a building or greenhouses with 24/7 7, climate control and, lighting control throughout the entire year to maximize grow rate. Some of which can be done even hydroponically, I think, or at least with very little contact with the ground and, a lot of water consumption. Yes, with security, but I wouldn't be surprised if the level of security is sort of personal observation and video cameras and, alarms, what would you call it? Automatic AI type stuff.
We want to opt in on the cultivation.
Mhm.
Would we have to draft our own set of regulations to control it without the any? Or
Yes, I think you would, and I
Yeah.
would say, but that's where I would say to you that your idea of being prudent and waiting, although it might harm the competitive edge that the town would have over another. I'm not saying you want to have a competitive edge. I'm just saying, think logically. If you're first in, you're first, likely to get something. The reality is, we don't know if the Cannabis Regulatory Commission will preempt and tell towns what they have to do when they allow a particular license, like cultivation. So we don't know if
this is the way to monetize something like this is to limit the amount of producers and limit the amount of retailers. And I can't imagine this being like, pizza parlors. I think it's going to be more like getting a liquor license than it is going to be like opening a pizza parlor, right? So you're not going to have 10 places in town selling pizza,
But see,
right?
but that's not necessarily true because of the allowance for the micro businesses.
right.
You can allow unlimited micro businesses. So you could have those smaller, and the micro business, I think, is set up, for cultivation by square footage. And I think for retail dispensary, the micro businesses is limited by proceeds, right? So you could allow smaller venues. It's interesting to some extent. The way the micro businesses may work is you may actually lower the marijuana, the revenue that everyone is projecting, whether it's in taxes or local taxes or state taxes, because there may just be, a lot of micro businesses and a lot of production. And
Join if you miss.
pricing just drops.
Isn't the way the liquor business works though so right now you could spend as much as $500,000 for a liquor license.
Or more.
But if you open, and depending on the location,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
But if you had a craft brewery, that isn't subject to the same sort of restrictions as a liquor. You don't need a liquor license to open it,
You do need a liquor license. It's a different type
It's a
of
different,
license.
yeah.
but they're not as few as there are liquor licenses.
So for example, right here in Bedminster with Burnt Mill Cidery, with that business, right? So it is on-site, it's not distillation,
Production.
but it's on-site production. And the license that goes with that allows the producer to sell both at wholesale and retail, but he's not allowed to sell beer or wine or hard alcohol. He's only allowed to sell what he produces there. So it's a different license. And the same thing for the wineries. So you've got the cidery, and I for some reason, I remember having discussions that the cider license is closer to a winery license than it is to a brewery license, so a craft brewer. But the same thing with the craft brewers, right? It all depends on what license they get. They can sell like down on Route 22, Sunken
But
Cider.
my point is that they're not restricted. There's only X number, in any municipality, in any county, there's only X number of liquor licenses to sell booze, beer, what have you.
Yeah,
That's strict regulated.
Yes.
If I wanted to open up a brewery or a winery or a cidery, I apply, I make the qualifications, I comply with all their regulations, I can get a license as long as I meet the standard.
And you're in your zone, and you're in the right zoning for it.
Right.
Right, so you're still subject to local regulation, but it's different than, the ABC with doing whether it's consumption or retail license for alcohol, right? So we've got in Bedminster, we have Pluckman Inn and Delicious Heights.
Mhm,
That's it.
Two liquor places.
mhm,
We have Colonial Liquors.
mhm.
That's it. Trump Golf Course has a club
Clubhouse,
license. And
Fiddlers.
I believe Fiddler's also has a club license and Hamilton has a club license.
Mhm,
So they fall under a different category.
right.
Easier for clubs to get.
You can start your own club.
I don't know if it's easier or not. I just know it's a different.
Poker
license.
club, Thursday nights.
So where is marijuana going? Where on the retail side? Don't know.
I'm just wondering if, rather than can be completely opting out, does it make sense for us to opt in on something like, production or growing subject to regulations?
And it very well may, and which is why, whenever those rules or regulations come out, it would be fair, not just fair, but appropriate for the municipality to take another look and say, okay, so here's the state structure for a grow facility, right? And just as Tom said, so, Farmer Brown has 40 acres. He wants to build a greenhouse with lights.
Buried inside a
Yeah,
100-acre farm.
right.
It might not even be.
And by the way, it's interesting also, under the legislation, I believe cannabis is not subject to the Right to Farm Act. So it's treated a little bit differently. Also, it's not, if you're doing a grow facility and you're on the agricultural side of marijuana, it's not, you're no longer exempt from, you're no longer eligible for the farmland assessment. That whatever land you're setting aside,
Last time, yeah.
whatever land you're setting aside for marijuana grow is not going to be assessed at farmland rates. It's going to be assessed at a commercial rate.
But you could have both,
Yeah, you still could have both.
but
on
you
the
just
property.
up that
But
piece.
if you're going to have a little section of land that's going to be dedicated to marijuana cultivation, that is not being treated as a farmland
And assessment.
assessment.
I think I'd like to see us opt out across the whole thing, but I'm concerned that we may be putting people at a later date, if what Tom says is true, if we may be putting people that want to get into this business later, once we opt in, are we going to put them at a competitive disadvantage because they weren't able to start? It's not that I, personally care too much if I'm putting them at a, but, in the spirit of free enterprise,
Well,
are we putting somebody at,
but that's the
disadvantaged by
that's
not.
the interesting thing about the micro businesses, is that the micro businesses are not limited in number. The municipalities can establish a threshold for micro businesses they allow. So Bedminster could say, we're gonna allow 30 micro cultivation businesses. 20, 100,
So you won't be putting them out of business.
Right.
It'll be just,
so now that's a micro,
to build a, 1,000 square foot greenhouse?
right?
Are we putting them at a disadvantage?
maybe,
So we don't know
but we
what's
don't
going
know
on
that.
yet.
But don't we expect that someone who wants to do that would come to the board at some point and say, I want to do this work? And at that point, we could say, okay, there's an interest
We could,
in, and start the process of whatever it takes to opt in.
Mhm.
And so just as Tom had mentioned that, the idea of preemption, if we come out with rules and regulations now, we may find ourselves, well, that all has to get thrown out, other than the opt-in. So you may be putting our own ability to regulate. Well, that may be jeopardized if we opt in with conditions, and those conditions are thrown out by the state preemption. So to some extent, you'd rather let the state say, here are the basic guidelines, municipalities, you can work in from there, but you can't work out or have something that's completely contrary.
just to put things in perspective, the state's gonna limit the number of cultivators to 37 for the first couple of years. That includes 12 that already exist. So there's a limited number who are even gonna have a cultivation license across the state,
Unless you go to the micro.
unless you're the
The
micro,
micro.
right?
Yeah, which is why I think you, and by the way, one of the issues with micro,
a chain of micros.
the issue with micros was, to some extent, I think this may be the policy behind it, is that it was precluding some in the urban minority scene from participating in the grow, because
They don't have
who's
farmland.
applying for the big cultivation licenses? It's the
Big
larger, the
landowners.
big companies. Right, so the idea of allowing micro, or micro licenses was a way of sort of spreading
Yeah.
that out and allowing smaller players to participate.
And those people have to be located in town. I think it has to be majority owned by residents in town.
This is Tom now. I just wanted to give you all a, like a refresher on use variances. Basically, even if we prohibit all 6 categories of licensed facility in Bedminster through an ordinance, a land use ordinance, any property, any applicant, contract purchaser, anyone could get an application before you at the land use board for a D variance to allow the use as a principal use to be granted permission by D variance by a vote of 5 of 7 of the land use board.
Great to hear the
Or,
positive criteria.
yeah, wait, and they give you free samples too. So you basically are in a situation where you just realize that a prohibited use does not mean no one can make an application for a use variance. And also, instead of just asking for a use variance, they could, or after they get denied a use variance, they could ask for the governing body and the board to change the zoning ordinance to opt back in and to let their use become a permitted use in some zone. That might might be more than one property, because one property is often spot zoning, but I'm just trying to tell you that it'll be just like any other prohibited use, okay? It doesn't make it more prohibited because you opted out.
Okay, I have a question. It's Lou. I apologize for coming in late. I saw that the Board of Health created a resolution that I'm assuming they forwarded to the Township Committee. Is our board at this point, or do we need to create a resolution? How are the mechanics of this supposed to
Yeah,
continue?
there's nothing formal on that, Lou. I'm not sure why the board chose to do a resolution. You have a different role though too, because after the committee introduces the ordinance, you will get what's called the consistency review.
Right.
So that's not that formal either. That's just, is it consistent or not inconsistent with the master plan? And, Frank and I believe that it's clearly not inconsistent with a master plan. It doesn't talk about cannabis. So that's sort of a non-issue. If you would like, I think what Larry is trying to get, but he can tell you more, is basically exactly what you're doing. Dialogue about this and give feedback to the township committee. So if you would like to make a motion, I could help you with something, but.
We're ready. Is there anybody else on the board? I think we've spent enough time and made everybody's opinion. I think we could have a resolution. Not a resolution, but a
Motion.
motion.
Okay, so if the board would entertain it, it sounds like it would be a motion to recommend to the township committee that they adopt an ordinance opting out of the cannabis license facility, all of the cannabis license facilities, because of the lack of time and the lack of details on the regulations from the Cannabis Regulatory Commission.
So do we hear a motion?
Motion to
motion.
approve.
Seconded.
Let Johnny make that motion. That's right.
All right, Scott, we'll let you have the first motion. You want to second it there, Rich?
I'll second it.
Okay. I guess we have a roll call on this, Tom?
Yes.
Okay. Janine?
Mayor Jacobs,
Aye.
Committeeman Hickey,
Aye.
Mr. Strakoff,
Aye.
Mr. Travellini,
Aye.
Mr. Rodelius,
Aye.
Mr. Leonard,
Aye.
Mr. DeGiovanni,
Aye.
Mr. Zupnik,
Aye.
Ms. Orabana,
Aye.
Mr. Walter,
Aye.
Committeeman Gutschall.
Aye. All right, committee, you know what to do.
All right.
Go ahead. I
Okay,
think you
no,
wanted
just
to
gonna go-
bring up something.
So we'll go to just board member comments or for.
Yeah, for
planning
your board,
So,
for our board.
two things is I had a conversation with the AT&T planning consultant team. So this is the group that Carol, George, and I and Rich met with many months ago. And in
Yeah.
the intervening time, there's been discussions with AT&T. There's been discussions with MetLife. There was a site tour. There was discussions with representatives from the local and state real estate organizations. There was discussions with Somerset County Business Partnership, with representatives from the office market, representatives from the life sciences market. And after collating those discussions as well as the independent research and the expertise that the consulting team brings, they are prepared to introduce some preliminary thoughts to the land use board, and they are available to meet next Thursday, their next meeting, so June 10th. So we'll have a presentation. This is, they haven't put in a formal means, pen to paper. So there'll be a brief, I guess is a brief PowerPoint discussion, but they essentially want to meet with the land use board, throw some ideas at us and sort of, react to whatever our comments are. And my guess is after that, then they will formalize the recommendations and start the public sessions regarding the AT&T planning and recommendations, if any, for zoning changes that might be appropriate for the.
And that would be prerequisite to us doing the overlay specifically?
Well, it would be recommendations, and it's up to the land use board to then decide to implement or not decide to implement.
Mhm. Right, right. And I assume this would be a Zoom meeting, the
Yeah,
county.
yeah, it'll be a Zoom meeting.
Yeah.
The county's not going to
Mhm.
come in person. So that's for
Next Thursday.
next Thursday. And the second issue is just to thank Scott Zupnik for his time and dedication to Bedminster, and particularly, in many facets, but certainly for his contributions to the Bedminster Land Use Board. Thank you, Scott.
I also wanted to say that to Scott, thank you for your service, and we will miss you, and you were certainly a contributor. So we wish you very well going forward in your new home, so.
Mr. Mayor, Madam Chair, thank you so much. I have learned a lot from every single one of you. You all bring a unique perspective to our board and our town, and I have learned and benefited immensely. Mr. Collins, Mr. Banish, and Mr. Ferraro, your professionalism and expertise have been, can't put a price on it, actually. So thank you all. And it's an experience I'll take with me as I go forward. So it's a great experience and I've learned a lot.
Thank you for that, Scott.
Thank you, Scott, and good luck.
Scott, you got any fishing advice for Bedminster?
I'll tell you, when you're choosing a lure, go small. Who doesn't like a hot cocktail, Frank?
That needs to go in the minutes, you need.
Okay, we just have a few more things. I know Lamington Farms is resubmitting their plans. They're not deemed
Nothing yet?
complete yet, but they are going to go forward with that. And also, we haven't got new plans or amended plans for Ferrari, that's 2206. So they have not been scheduled yet, but will be as soon as they do. And that's all I have for tonight. We have a motion.
Madam Chair, and one other thing, Larry, did you want to talk about that?
Oh, do you have
That's-
something else?
All right, Janine, calm down, Janine. Calm down, Janine. So, yeah, I'm sorry, and I did send, there was a reported case that was, I saw today was, I guess it was published today on, Tom, what town was it in?
So that was Moorestown, I believe. Let me just check. Moorestown down in South Jersey.
Okay, so Moorestown down in South Jersey, there was an applicant who came with, I guess it was to the zoning board, requesting to build on top of his garage to build on top of his garage and convert it to basically an au pair suite. And it was denied by the board. And the board said the construction of that dwelling unit would constitute a second dwelling unit detached from the house, and denied it. It was challenged, and the court upheld the board's decision. And the reason I wanted to bring it to Tom's attention is, you know, when I look at all these different cases that are floating back and forth, I said, you know, this is something that we sort of deal with, you know, almost on a regular basis here in town. Right, for farms, for horse properties, carriage houses.
All the grooms.
Right, so, you know, I just asked, you know, I asked Tom to just take a quick look at it and sort of run over the court's rationale. And if that distinction is appropriate to how our ordinances read and how we've interpreted it regarding these auxiliary residential units.
Okay. Thanks, Larry. Good summary. And basically, everybody, this is an interesting case. It is a little different than Bedminster because it's a classic single-family zone, but a very large house in a classic single-family 1 acre type zone. And the other difference is that our ordinance is different than theirs, but their ordinance did say in it that you could have an accessory unit in your house or housekeeping unit for a domestic employee who resides with the family. But it also had a definition of single family house that was clearly different than the garage, the separate garage on this property. So what the family had done is, even though they didn't have any kids and even though they didn't have any au pair yet, they went to the zoning officer, and the zoning officer actually denied their request to put it in the garage, put a unit in the garage for an au pair that they didn't yet have. And they then appealed that denial to the zoning board. They didn't really ask for a use variance or a variance, and the zoning board agreed with the zoning officer, denied their permission, said it's not in the house, it's not part of the residence. It's a separate single family unit. Now, the reason I say, so that was very interesting. It does relate to the specifics of that ordinance and that particular property. Now, in your town, you don't specifically allow a living suite for a domestic employee living in the house. Although I would say to you that the definition of family, this is an amazing subject, but the definition of single family in New Jersey is constitutionally protected since like the 1960s or so, in a case Baker v. State, that basically says family is anyone who lives and occupies the same residence. It doesn't matter whether they're related by blood or marriage or otherwise, and they don't have to have any legal relationship. As long as they share the same kitchen and bathroom in the same single family house, they are a family. So that's a constitutional protection. But what you have is, unlike other towns, you have many situations in the estate or 10-acre zone where, this is kind of shocking, many of these places exist before zoning existed. Zoning is only about 100 years old. Zoning was established in the 1920s by a progressive movement, and until that progressive movement throughout the country to authorize zoning, there was no zoning. You could do anything anywhere on any property unless there was some sort of deed restriction against it or some other statute, but not zoning. So houses existed with many different types of gatehouses and with many different types of houses for apartments or condos or what, not condos, but basically living units for many people. And so that's what you have some legacy of in Bedminster. And recognizing that legacy, the township, unlike other townships in the R10 zone, allows one accessory dwelling unit as a conditional use, not in the definition of the single family use, but in a conditional use as an accessory dwelling unit with specific conditions. And those conditions are listed in the statute. And that's the way, in the ordinance, and that's the only way you're allowed to get a new accessory dwelling units, but you might have existing ones that predate that and don't meet those conditions. And that is something you're dealing with. But that being said, you only allow one, you restrict the size. You also only allow it if there's a 14-acre lot, not just a 10-acre lot, or 14 or more. You only allow it if it's certain size, a certain distance from the main unit, and some very specific conditions of the conditional use. So if someone wants to get one that is new and doesn't meet those conditions, they need to come for a D variance for deviations from the conditions of the conditional use. And where someone wants to modify the existing ones, they, like the Spook Hollow case, they have to come back to the board or come to the board for a D variance to allow that deviation from the conditions of the conditional use. And so that helps you see then that ordinance, your ordinance, is different than Moorestown's ordinance, but also helps you see that towns can have ordinances that establish different standards for accessory dwelling units. And this is a very interesting area. It's even more interesting when you get into Airbnb and all kinds of things like that. But let's focus just on this for tonight. And this case, maybe we'll distribute it to you. It helps you see some of the issues related to accessory dwelling units and how people try to argue all kinds of arguments about their right to do things like accessory dwelling units. And there's probably a lot of illegal units in the world, but that doesn't mean that they're authorized. Okay.
Mhm. Thank you, Tom. Anything else? No?
Nope.
Then we will ask for a motion to adjourn.
Scott, you want to make that?
Absolutely. One other thing, Janine, thanks for everything. You're a doll. You've been nothing but a help since you came on board. And with that, a motion to adjourn.
Second.
Here.
I'll second.
Good night, all.
Good night.
Good night.
Night all.
Right, everybody.
Take good care, everybody.
You too,
Bye,
Scott.
Bye.
Yeah,